There is a particular kind of tragedy that belongs only to those who destroy themselves, not through weakness, not through lack of power or resources or opportunity, but through the compulsive, almost methodical dismantling of their own advantages. Adolf Hitler was the most dangerous kind of leader the modern world had ever produced. He was bold where others were cautious. He was fast where others were slow. He was willing to gamble everything when conventional minds refused debate at all. And for a period between 1939 and 1941, those qualities made him the most successful military conqueror in European history since Napoleon. And then, one by one, decision by decision, he threw it all away. This is not a simple story about a villain who deserved to lose. History is never that clean. This is a story about specific moments, specific decisions, specific orders given and refused, specific opportunities seized and squandered, that together add to one of the most consequential sequences of military error in the history of warfare. These were not inevitable mistakes. At each turning point, a different choice was available. At each moment of failure, the correct alternative was visible, often argued for with great passion by the professional soldiers around him. Hitler saw those alternatives. He understood them, and he chose differently every single time. Understanding why he chose as he did, and what those choices cost, is not merely an exercise in military history. It is a lesson in the relationship between ego, ideology, and the strategic reality. It is a warning about what happens when a man mistakes the willingness to take risks for the possession of genuine military judgment. And it is a portrait of how the most powerful war machine in Europe in 1940 was methodically reduced to rubble and ash by the man who commanded it. To understand Hitler's military mistakes, you first have to understand his military successes. Because without the successes, the mistakes make no more sense. They were not random failures of an incompetent. They were the predictable consequences of a set of genuine strengths taken past the point where they remained strengths and allowed to become fatal weaknesses. Hitler came to military command with no more formal military education beyond his service as a corporal in the First World War. He had no more staff class training, no more understanding of logistics at the operational level, no more experience commanding units larger than a messenger section. What he had instead was an extraordinary intuition for political timing, an iron nerve in moments of crisis when trained professionals hesitated, and the inability to read the psychological state of his opponents that bordered on genius during the years when those opponents were democracies weakened by pacifism and traumatized by memories of the previous war. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the absorption of the Sudetenland after Munich, the occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Each of these actions was taken against the advice of the German military establishment, which predicted catastrophic Allied responses that never materialized. Each time Hitler gambled and he won, his contempt for the professional military deepened and his confidence in his own judgment grew. By 1939, he genuinely believed that he understood strategy better than his generals. The generals who had been right about tactics and the logistics and the military capacity had been wrong about the political and the psychological dimensions of each crisis. And so Hitler concluded that their professional expertise was a form of institutional timidity that his own instinct could override. This was the foundation on which all the subsequent disasters were built. The war began in September tahun 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and it was, by any military standard, a masterpiece of planning and the execution. The Wehrmacht moved with a speed and the coordination that the Polish military, fighting with courage but against overwhelming odds, could not withstand. Within weeks, Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Then came the turn of the West, and the campaign of May and June 1940 that stunned the world. The fall of France was not inevitable. The French army was large, reasonably well equipped, and defending from prepared positions. The British Expeditionary Force was set in support. The Allied commanders expected the German main attack to come through Belgium, as it had in 1914. They were prepared for that. What they were not prepared for was the armor thrust to the Ardennes forest, a route that conventional military thinking considered impossible for large armored formations. It was Erich von Manstein's plan, not Hitler's, though Hitler recognized its brilliance and backed it against the objections of more cautious minds in the German High Command. The result was the most rapid and complete defeat of a major Western European power in modern history. France fell in 6 weeks. The British escaped from Dunkirk, but they left behind their equipment, their vehicles, their artillery, virtually everything that an army needs to fight. Germany stood supreme in Western Europe, and then came the first mistake, the one that, had it not happened, might have changed everything. The evacuation at Dunkirk. In the final days of May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped against the English Channel with German armored forces within striking distance of cutting them off entirely. Over 300,000 men were crowded onto the beaches at Dunkirk and the surrounding areas. They were exhausted, disorganized, and largely without their heavy equipment. A determined armored assault would almost certainly have destroyed or captured the majority of them. The loss of 300,000 trained soldiers, the entire professional corps of the British Army, at a single stroke, would have been a blow from which Britain might not have recovered quickly enough to continue the war. Hitler halted the armored advance. He issued the famous stop order on May the 24th, 1940. The reasons behind it are still debated by historians. Hermann Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone could destroy the trapped British forces. The armored commanders needed time to regroup and refit before the next phase of operations. The terrain around Dunkirk, with its canals and the soft ground, was genuinely difficult for tanks. There may have been a political calculation involved. I believe that Britain might be more willing to negotiate peace if its army escaped annihilation. Whatever the reasoning, the consequences were unambiguous. The British evacuated over 300,000 men across the Channel over 9 days. Those men formed the nucleus around which the British Army rebuilt itself. The war that might have ended in 1940 with a negotiated peace from a Britain stripped of its army continued. And he continued. Churchill's government, strengthened rather than weakened by the Dunkirk evacuation, which the British public embraced as a kind of national miracle, refused to negotiate. The Battle of Britain followed through the summer of 1940, and the Luftwaffe, for all its power, could not break the Royal Air Force or break British civilian morale. Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain, was postponed and then quietly abandoned. Britain remained in the war, and Britain remaining in the war meant that, eventually, America would have a platform from which to enter it. The Dunkirk halt order is the first great hinge of the war, but it was only the beginning. The Battle of Britain itself produced Hitler's second catastrophic mistake. Through July and August of 1940, the Luftwaffe had been pursuing a coherent and increasingly effective strategy. It was attacking RAF fighter commands, airfields, radar stations, and the ground infrastructure. The British fighter control system, the network of radar, ground observers, and the sector operations rooms that allowed fighter command to deploy its Spitfires and the Hurricanes efficiently, was being degraded. The airfields at Biggin Hill, Manston, Canley, and the others were being damaged to the point where some were barely operational. The British were losing pilots and the aircraft faster than they could replace them. Another few weeks of sustained pressure on the same targets, and the fighter command might have reached a breaking point. Dan, in early September tahun 1940, a German bomber crew navigating in darkness dropped bombs on London by mistake. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The raid was small and it caused minimal damage, but the symbolic impact on Hitler was volcanic. He was furious. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attack from RAF airfields to London and the other British cities. The Blitz began. It was a catastrophic strategic error. The pressure on fighter command was instantly relieved. The airfields that had been on the edge of collapse were given time to repair and recover. The radar network that had been degraded began to function properly again. Fighter command, which had been bleeding out, stabilized. And the bombing of London, terrible as it was for British civilians, did not break British morale. It stiffened it. The image of Churchill standing in the rubble, the stories of ordinary Londoners sleeping in the underground, the defiant continuation of daily life under bombardment. These things became the defining narrative of British national character during the war. Hitler's rage had handed Churchill one of his most powerful propaganda gifts. The Battle of Britain was lost not because the Luftwaffe lacked the capability to win it. It was lost because Hitler could not control his own anger long enough to let a winning strategy reach its conclusion. But even these mistakes, catastrophic as they were, might have been survivable had Hitler not then made the decision that most historians regard as the single most consequential strategic error of the war. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in the history of human warfare. Over 3 million German and the Axis soldiers crossed a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The Wehrmacht's opening moves were stunning in their success. Soviet forces, caught partially unprepared despite multiple intelligence warnings that Stalin had refused to believe, were shattered in their forward positions. In the first weeks, German armored formations encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies. The numbers of prisoners taken were almost incomprehensible. At Kiev in September tahun 1941, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured. It was the largest encirclement in military history. And yet Barbarossa failed, and the reasons why it failed point directly to Hitler. The first problem was the fundamental strategic incoherence of the operation's objectives. Germany did not have the industrial capacity or the manpower reserves to fight a prolonged war against the Soviet Union while simultaneously maintaining its position in Western Europe and North Africa. Barbarossa was premised on the belief that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, that the communist state was, as Hitler famously described it, a rotten structure that would fall with a single kick. The German military had 6 weeks of supply prepared for the invasion. 6 weeks. If the Soviet Union did not collapse within 6 weeks, the operation had no more sustainable strategic basis. The Soviet Union did not collapse. It bent, it bled, it lost territory and the men and the equipment at rates that would have destroyed any Western European military establishment several times over. And yet kept fighting. When the 6-week timeline passed and the Soviets had not broken, the German military needed a clear, unified strategic objective to focus its remaining strength. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was within striking distance of Moscow. The German generals, Heinz Guderian foremost among them, argued passionately that Moscow was the critical target, not merely because it was the Soviet capital, but because the road and the rail network of the entire Western Soviet Union converged on Moscow. Taking it would paralyze Soviet logistics and force a decisive defensive battle that the weakened Red Army might not survive. Hitler disagreed. He wanted the economic resources of Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus. He diverted Army Group Centres Armor South to support the drive on Kiev in August ke-1941. The Kiev encirclement was a tactical triumph of enormous scale. It was also the decision that cost Germany the war. The diversion to Kiev consumed weeks that could not be recovered. When the drive on Moscow finally resumed in October 1941, under Operation Typhoon, German forces came within striking distance of the Soviet capital. At some points they were close enough that German officers with binoculars reported being able to see the spires of the Kremlin. But close enough was not enough. The autumn rains had turned Russian roads into impassable mud. The early winter had begun with temperatures that the German army, supplied for a summer campaign, was not equipped to survive. The men had no more winter clothing. The lubricants in the weapons and the vehicles froze. The tanks seized. The rifles misfired. And the Soviets, who had been using the time bought by the Kiev diversion to move fresh divisions from Siberia, divisions equipped and trained for winter warfare, launched a devastating counterattack in December 1941 that drove the Germans back from Moscow and shattered the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility. The moment the German army fell to take Moscow in 1941, the war entered a phase that Germany could not win. The Soviet industrial relocation program, which had moved entire factory complexes beyond the Ural Mountains and out of German reach, was producing tanks and aircraft and artillery in quantities that German industry could not match. American Lend-Lease was beginning to flow, adding trucks, jeeps, food, and raw materials to the Soviet war economy. Time was now working against Germany, and Hitler had given the Soviets the time they needed. Then came December the 7th, ke-1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and 4 days later, in one of the most inexplicable decisions of the entire war, he was not obligated to do so. The tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan contained no more provision requiring Germany to declare war on America if Japan initiated a conflict. Hitler chose to do it. He did it because he believed war with America was coming regardless, because he wanted to give his U-boats permission to attack American shipping without restriction. And perhaps because after the failure before Moscow he needed a dramatic gesture to demonstrate that the strategic initiative remained with Germany. The declaration of war on the United States was, in purely strategic terms, an act of almost suicidal recklessness. America was the largest industrial economy in the world. Its potential military production, once mobilized, dwarfed anything Germany could contemplate. Roosevelt had been looking for a way into the European war for 2 years and had been frustrated by American isolationism. Hitler handed him the justification he needed on a plate. American industry began retooling for war production at a scale that would eventually produce ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapons in quantities that defied comprehension. The arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised to create became reality, and it was aimed directly at Germany. The year 1942 brought new disasters. After the failure before Moscow, Hitler made a decision that revealed how completely he had lost his grasp on strategic reality. Rather than consolidating and preparing a coherent defense, he launched another massive summer offensive, this time aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and, simultaneously, at the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad. The name has become synonymous with military catastrophe, but it did not begin that way. The German Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus advanced toward Stalingrad through the summer of 1942 with considerable success. Soviet resistance was fierce, but German forces reached the city and began fighting their way through it. Block by block and building by building, in some of the most savage urban combat of the entire war. The fighting inside Stalingrad was unlike anything that had come before. The Soviet defenders, under commanders like Vasily Chuikov, understood something that the Germans did not initially grasp. In close urban combat, at ranges of meters rather than kilometers, the Wehrmacht's advantage in combined arms coordination, in air support and the artillery, was dramatically reduced. The Soviets hugged the German lines so closely that German air and the artillery support became dangerous to their own troops. Snipers and the close quarters combat replaced the sweeping armored maneuver that had made the Wehrmacht so terrifying in open country. The city became a grinding, brutal, attritional nightmare. And while the Sixth Army bled itself white fighting for rubble, Hitler ignored the critical vulnerability that his own offensive had created. The flanks of the German advance toward Stalingrad were enormous and they were held by German allied forces, Romanian, Hungarian, and the Italian armies that were less well equipped, less well trained, and far less resilient than German formations. The Soviets saw this. They planned for it. And in November tahun 1942, Soviet Operation Uranus struck exactly those weaknesses. Two massive Soviet armored thrusts smashed through the Romanian armies on the north and the south flanks of the German salient and linked up behind the Sixth Army. Over 300,000 German and the Axis soldiers were surrounded. The response of the German High Command was to attempt a relief operation and to supply the encircled army by air. Both failed. The relief operation, Operation Winterstorm, came close, advancing to within 40 miles of the Stalingrad pocket before being halted. Had Paulus been given permission to break out and fight his way to meet the relief force, the Sixth Army might have been saved. Hitler refused. He ordered Paulus to hold. He was obsessed with the symbolic importance of the city that bore Stalin's name. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the encircled army by air. It could not deliver remotely enough. The men inside the pocket began to starve. In February 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. 90,000 men walked into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The battle had cost Germany 300,000 soldiers, an entire army, irreplaceable experienced veterans, and the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. It had cost the Soviets enormously as well, around 1 million casualties in the broader Stalingrad campaign. But the Soviets could absorb those losses. Germany could not. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological turning point visible to the entire world. The Wehrmacht had been shown to be defeatable. The myth of German invincibility was gone. Allied governments and the populations who had feared that Germany might actually win began to believe, for the first time with real conviction, that it would lose. After Stalingrad, there was one more moment when Germany might have stabilized the Eastern Front and created conditions for a negotiated end to the war. In the summer of 1943, the German military prepared Operation Citadel, an armored offensive aimed at cutting off a large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. The plan was sound in conception. A successful pincer attack at Kursk would destroy a significant portion of Soviet armored strength and restore some semblance of German initiative in the east. But Hitler delayed and delayed. The offensive, originally planned for May 1943, was postponed repeatedly while Hitler waited for more of the new Tiger and the Panzer tanks to be delivered to the front. The delays were fatal. The Soviets, who had intelligence of the operation through their spy networks, used every week of delay to prepare defenses of extraordinary depth and density. They built its successive defensive lines extending up to 300 kilometers behind the front. They laid over 1 million mines. They concentrated enormous quantities of anti-tank guns. They prepared their own armored reserves for the inevitable counterattack. When Citadel finally launched in July 1943, it ran directly into the most heavily prepared defensive position in the history of warfare. The German armored spearheads suffered catastrophic losses against the layered defenses. The Battle of Prokhorovka, often described as the largest tank battle in history, saw German and the Soviet armor clash in a confused and devastating engagement that the Germans could not afford and the Soviets could. Within days it was clear that Citadel had failed. Hitler cancelled it. The cancellation of Citadel, combined with Allied landings in Sicily, which created a new crisis demanding German attention, ended any possibility of German offensive action in the east. From this point forward, Germany was on the defensive everywhere: on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, in the Mediterranean against the Americans and the British, and soon in Normandy against the greatest amphibious operation in history. The response to the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, produced yet another critical Hitler mistake, this one in the deployment of armored reserves. The German commanders in France, Erwin Rommel among them, understood that the key to defeating an Allied landing was to destroy it on the beaches before the landing force could consolidate and build up supplies and reinforcements. Rommel wanted the armored reserves positioned close to the coast where they could respond immediately. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt wanted them held by a central reserve position from which they could be committed once the mine landing was identified. Hitler resolved the dispute by keeping the armored reserves under his personal command, requiring his direct authorization before they could be moved. On June 6th, as American, British, and the Canadian troops fought their way off the Normandy beaches, the powerful armored reserves that might have driven them back into the sea sat idle, waiting for Hitler's authorization. Hitler was asleep. His staff were afraid to wake him. By the time the reserves were released and they began moving toward Normandy, Allied air power had turned the road network into a killing ground. Movement in daylight was nearly impossible. The armored divisions that might have been decisive on June 6th arrived piecemeal over the following days, and by then the Allies had established a beachhead that could be supplied and reinforced faster than Germany could concentrate forces to destroy it. The battle for Normandy that followed was a grinding attritional struggle that German forces could not win. The Allied material advantage was too great. The American and the British logistical system, operating through the improvised Mulberry harbors and then through the captured port of Cherbourg, was feeding men and the equipment into France at a rate Germany could not match. By August 1944, the German position in France was collapsing. The Falaise pocket trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers. Paris was liberated. The Germans fell back toward their own borders, and still Hitler would not consider negotiating. There were figures in the German military and the political establishment who understood that the war was lost and who attempted. In July 1944, they ended by removing Hitler himself. The bomb placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg at the Wolf's Lair on July 20th, 1944, came close. A heavy oak conference table deflected the blast. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The conspirators were rounded up and executed with savage brutality. And Hitler, shaken but alive, became if anything more determined than before, more convinced of his own providential destiny, more suspicious of his generals, more resistant to any advice that contradicted his own judgment. The final act came in December 1944 with Operation Watch on the Rhine, The Ardennes Offensive, the last major German offensive operation of the war. The concept was audacious to the point of delusion. German armored forces would break through the lightly held American lines in the Ardennes, drive to the Meuse River, then swing north to capture Antwerp, cutting off the British and the Canadian armies from their supply base. It was, in some ways, our prize of the 1940 Ardennes offensive that had destroyed France. The German generals knew it could not work. The fuel was not there. The manpower was not there. Allied air power, absent during the overcast weather of the initial offensive, would return and devastate any exposed German armor the moment the skies cleared. They told Hitler all of this. He ignored them. The offensive achieved initial surprise. American units in the Ardennes were overwhelmed in the opening hours. The lines bent dramatically. The bulge in the Allied front that gave the battle its English name was real and initially alarming, but it was not deep enough, and it was not fast enough. American forces at Bastogne held despite being surrounded. The commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responding to a German demand for surrender with a single word that became one of the most famous in American military history. The skies cleared on December the 23rd. Allied air power fell on the German columns with devastating effect. American armor under General George Patton turned north with remarkable speed and broke through to relieve Bastogne. The Ardennes offensive failed. It failed at the cost of Germany's last strategic reserve. The forces committed to the Ardennes, the tanks, the fuel, the experienced soldiers, were forces that could have been used to defend the Rhine, or the Oder, or any one of the successive defensive lines that might have slowed the Allied advance in bad time. Instead, they were consumed in an offensive that achieved nothing except to hasten the collapse. By early 1945, Germany was being invaded from east and west simultaneously. Soviet forces crossed the Oder in January and drove toward Berlin. American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March. Hitler, in the bunker beneath Berlin, continued to issue orders to armies that no more longer existed, to plan counterattacks with forces that had been destroyed, to insist that the war could still be won by will alone when every military reality had long since made victory impossible. He had, in the years between 1940 and 1945, turned a position of genuine dominance in European affairs into total catastrophe. He had let 300,000 British soldiers escape at Dunkirk when they might have been trapped. He had abandoned a winning strategy in the Battle of Britain to satisfy his personal anger. He had invaded the Soviet Union with 6 weeks of supplies and no more plan for what happened if 6 weeks was not enough. He had diverted his armor from Moscow to Kiev and he caused himself the campaign season that might have ended the war in the East. He had declared war on the United States without obligation or necessity. He had refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out from Stalingrad when breakout was still possible and he had lost an entire army. He had delayed Citadel until the window of opportunity closed. He had kept his armored reserves under personal control on the day and he wasted the one chance to destroy the Allied landing. He had thrown his last reserves into the Ardennes in a gamble that every professional soldier around him told him could not succeed. Each of these decisions, examined individually, reveals a different dimension of the same fundamental failure. The failure to distinguish between the courage required to take calculated risks and the recklessness of taking uncalculated ones. The failure to listen to professional expertise when it conflicted with instinct. The failure to recognize that willpower, however fierce, cannot substitute for fuel, ammunition, trained men, and the time. The failure, above all, to understand that war is not a battle of wills alone. It is a collision of economies, of populations, of industrial systems, of logistics chains, and of the unglamorous mathematics of production and the supply that determine, in the long run, what is possible and what is not. Hitler won his early victories by being bolder than his opponents. He lost the war by confusing boldness with wisdom. He mistook the willingness to gamble for strategic insight. He mistook the early results of his gambles, results that were often spectacular, for confirmation that his instincts were superior to professional military judgment. And each success fed the next bet, and the next, and the next, until the accumulated weight of strategic reality came due all at once, and there was nothing left to pay the debt with except the lives of millions of people who had no more choice in the matter. The most powerful military machine in Europe in 1940 was destroyed not primarily by its enemies. It was destroyed by its commander. That is the bitter, irreducible truth at the center of this story. And it is a truth that does not belong only to history. The pattern it describes, of a leader who mistakes early success for permanent superiority, who surrounds himself with people afraid to tell him the truth, who substitutes conviction for competence, who cannot distinguish between the moment to be bold and the moment to be careful, who believes that will alone can overcome material reality, is not a pattern that ended in 1945. It is a pattern that repeats, that has always repeated, in boardrooms and in cabinet rooms and in command posts throughout history. The lesson is not simply that Hitler lost. The lesson is how he lost. Decision by decision, opportunity by opportunity, until there was nothing left. And the silence that fell over Europe in May 1945, over the rubble of Berlin and the liberated death camps and the shattered cities and the tens of millions of graves stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, that silence was the sound of what happens when power without wisdom is finally, at catastrophic cost, brought to its end.